Welcome to the All About You podcast. My name is Sheila and I am your host. In this podcast, I invite everyday people to tell their stories of their travels, passions, and what makes them happy. So if you have a story to tell, please contact me on allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com and let's tell your story. So now for today's conversation. Welcome to the All About You podcast. And today my guest is Judy Mansfield and she's a celebrant. A celebrant is a person who performs or officiates ceremonies such as weddings, funerals, baby namings and memorials. I always thought this would be quite an interesting job, so I'm delighted to welcome Judy to the All About You podcast. Judy, welcome, and I'm very, very happy to have you as a guest.
Hi Sheila, and thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Good. Well, I'm looking forward to be educated about the world of being a celebrant. So Judy, can you give us an introduction, please?
Certainly. Well, I've been a celebrant now for, 9 years. Time really flies. And the variety that comes into my life is just brilliant as a celebrant. And you encapsulated what it is so very well in your introduction, that I design and deliver ceremonies for people for baby namings, for weddings, for funerals. I'm not a humanist, and people often make that mistake, because a humanist is a belief system, humanism, and they won't allow any religious content whatsoever because it's out with their beliefs. Whereas I'm all about people's beliefs, not mine. So if people want religious content, especially for funerals, people tend to turn to the comfort of the Lord's Prayer, for example, or a hymn. And at baby namings and weddings, I'll include prayers and hymns if that's what people want. So I design it around the family or the couple in front of me. And I never know what direction it will go. So it can be something quite formal in say a wedding in a swanky hotel, or it could be something in the middle of a woodland or on a beach, or it's really so different. And I write it each time. Really at heart, I'm a storyteller. That's what I am. I tell people stories, and it's an incredibly exciting privilege, because you're allowed into people's lives and to their innermost thoughts and hopes and fears and dreams and regrets sometimes as well. People will tell you all sorts of things, so you have to be open to what is appropriate to put into the ceremony for public consumption, and what is best kept discreet and away from the ceremony. So you have to be aware of that. And you also have to listen for silences as well when people are talking to you. And that's especially for funerals and memorial services. Sometimes, how did your mum and dad, how did they meet? How did they get on? Or, what about your brother? Your brother's not here. And there'll be a silence. And you've got to very gently explore where that silence is, because one thing I've discovered is that there's no such thing as the perfect family. Every family has their issues, my own included, but you deal with things sensitively as you go on. Similarly with weddings, you might be surprised what couples will tell you about their lives together, and sometimes I think, oh no, too much information there. So it's and some couples will be having a wedding after a very difficult time. Sometimes perhaps they may be having a vow renewal after a difficult period of time. Perhaps there's been a separation, or one of the couple has been very ill. I've also done weddings where one of the couples has been terminally ill and they want to make their vows to one another before the inevitable happens. And so those are very difficult to write, but incredibly rewarding. When my email inbox pings with I hear you're a celebrant, would you be able to help us? You never know in what direction that's going to take you. And that's the incredible thing about it.
So Judy, when did you first get the idea to become a celebrant?
Well, do you know, I never had the idea. I fell into it almost by accident. And I think Celebrancy chose me. My husband and I had been living in France for a decade. We'd gone out there just for a couple of years. I was going to take time off work. I worked for the Ministry of Defence. I was taking extended leave to do my MBA. And we had a holiday cottage that we owned. So we said, oh, let's just go and spend the summer in the holiday cottage. And when we were out there, we idly had the conversation, well, wouldn't it be lovely to live here full time? You know, just chuck your watch in the drawer. And so we ended up just selling up in England and having an adventure in France that was supposed to be for the summer and ended up being for 10 years. We came back because our parents were all ill. They were all getting elderly and more frail and needed more care. And we kept having to make emergency trips back to the UK. And it got so bad that we said, you know what, the time has come to come back home and look after them. So we came back home. I'd resigned from the Ministry of Defence years before, so I had no job. And I went along to a business meeting, a women's business group, and just to meet people. And I thought, well, if it's horrible and they don't speak to me, I'll just pretend I'm going to the toilet and come home. But they were so lovely and so welcoming. Chairwoman said, oh, we need a speaker for next week. Our speaker's dropped out. Can anyone help? It's for a do in Coventry. And before I could stop myself, I heard my voice saying, oh, I'll do that. And then I thought, oh God, whatever am I going to talk about? And it was too late because they said marvellous and my name was on the list. So I went along the following week and it was a big business group. And I talked about how to do business with the French. And because I had some experience of it. And afterwards, over coffee, somebody came up to me and said, oh, that was really entertaining. It was got a lovely voice and you'd make a marvellous celebrant. And I said, oh, thank you very much. And I thought, whatever is a celebrant? I had no idea. Came home and Googled it and I thought, yeah, there's my career. So I researched and did, found a training course and the rest, as they say, is history. I was able to draw on previous experience when I worked in the Ministry of Defence. I worked for government ministers. And so I had experience of writing accurately and under pressure, under time pressure, and public speaking as well with work. So I thought, well, let's bring those skills in a different direction. And I absolutely love it. Love it.
So, Judy, what type of form does the training take?
It depends what training organisation you go to. I'm actually now myself, I'm a tutor for celebrants with a company called Civil Ceremonies, run by a fantastic lady called Anne Barber. So you can do a really intensive course. So you do distance learning. And when you've completed that, all the assessments are marked because it all goes towards an NVQ qualification. And then once you've got through the theory, you then go and do your practical, which is a week in a hotel, and you put all that into practice. So you actually practice writing and delivering scripts, you practice voice control and intonation and things like that. And there's a course for funerals and one for weddings and celebration ceremonies. You can also do distance learning only. Some companies will offer those. But I think you lose out a little bit there if you just do it by correspondence course, because it's such a very personal thing that you do. And you need to see yourself as others see you, because you may be like Shakespeare in the way you write and have a beautiful turn of phrase in your written work. But if your delivery falls, or your interviewing skills when you're meeting with a family, if you don't get the correct information, then it will all fall apart. So you really need practice at that as well. because we can all improve.
Your job is basically stand in front of an audience of people, whether that's a funeral, whether that's a wedding or a memorial. Everybody has got their eyes on you, and public speaking is right up there with people's top fears.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's why I'm always so full of admiration for anyone who wants to speak at a funeral, to deliver a eulogy or tribute, or even to read a poem, or at a wedding. And people will say, oh yeah, I'll be fine, I do lots of public speaking at work. And they may well do, but what they're not factoring in is the emotion that's engendered. And there'll be tears from bridesmaids when they're reading a poem for their sister, or you'll get a big strapping CEO of a company who tries to deliver the eulogy for his mum and just can't do it. I always discuss that with people, and I say, before I invite you to the lectern, I'll look across to you, and if you can't do it, just shake your head and I will deliver it on your behalf. And nobody would ever know that you meant to and couldn't, because nobody knows how they'll feel on the day. So it's that emotional element. And as a professional celebrant, you're able to step back a little bit from the emotion. And we have to, I would never want a family to remember the ceremony as the one where the celebrant fell apart, because of emotion. And some ceremonies we do are incredibly emotional, like the end of life wedding, or like the baby funeral. They are incredibly difficult, and you have to be able to hold that space for the people you're working with.
It's very interesting, because when I started looking at your website and thinking about the role of a celebrant, I was initially thinking of the weddings and renewing your vows. But when you look at the other side, the memorials, and as you say, and the weddings, end of life weddings, and for children example, I mean, you've got to be made of strong stuff to be able, as you say, to hold it all together. You've got to be professional, you've got to be clear, you've got to be concise. So yeah, it's not an easy role, Judy, is it? I mean,
it isn't. I mean, somebody once said to me, "Oh, I wouldn't mind your job, a couple of £100 for half an hour's work." And I thought, oh, if only it was as simple as pitching up at the crematorium, reading something ready prepared for me, and then going again. It isn't. It as you say, Sheila, it's about so much more than that. Each ceremony I do, it's as if it's the only one I'm working on, because I want to do my very best for that family, because it's a massive transition, as somebody departs this world for the next, whatever your beliefs may be, it's a transition for them. And so it's got to be right. So I take an immense pride in that. And you do learn different tips and tricks and strategies on how to manage your own emotions, because I think every celebrant should have the mantra, it's not about you. It's about the couple or the family or the baby, or, whoever you're working with.
So Judy, can we talk now, if you can remember your very first engagement as a celebrant?
I can remember. I think you never forget your first ceremony. And I held off for a while doing funerals and did weddings and namings first, because emotionally they're easier to do. And it was over in Norwich. And so it was a heck of a trek, because I was living in Warwickshire at the time. But when you're a new celebrant, you tend to think, oh, I wonder if I'll get any work. Will anybody want me to be their celebrant? And so when somebody rings you and says, oh, yes, I'm in Timbuktu, you say, oh, yes, I'll do that. Thinking, let's just get some work and get some weddings on the website. So off I went to Norfolk. I had to go out there to meet the couple, get their story, talk to them. And then, of course, I had to go back again for the wedding. So it was 2 return trips. So I think I probably made about 20 quid on that very first ceremony after all my expenses. But it was in a barn on the bride's family, at the bride's family home. And it was such a shame, because it absolutely lashed it down with rain. It stopped for the wedding, but the bride's dad, who'd gardened for a whole year to get his garden perfect for the wedding to be outdoors. He was so protective of his lawn that he didn't want, you know, hundreds of feet trampling all over it. Luckily, they had a beautiful barn. It was all dressed up with fairy lights, and it was lovely. It was magical.
I think with most things, isn't it, you can do all the training, you can do all the practice. The first time you get out there and do it for real, that's when you really start learning.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I still get butterflies now when I'm, you know, when I'm waiting with often with the bridegroom and the best man, and all the guests are there in their finery, and you're waiting for the bride to arrive. And I still get that little tingle, performance nerves, I suppose. And the same, you know, with a funeral, when I walk in, because I will lead the coffin and the procession into the chapel, and my tummy just goes over a little bit. Just for that moment, I take a deep breath to ground myself, and away we go. And as soon as I get to the lectern, because I know my content and I know my script, then I know it will go fine. But as you say, you have to be aware of things that can go wrong. I've had a bridegroom who fainted at a wedding. I had a bride's nana who was living with dementia, and she was sitting on the front, and every time I spoke, she was a bit like Catherine Tate's nan, you know, and she said, "Oh God, she's off again. What's she on about now?" And this loud voice. It was so funny. The bride at first was going, "Oh, Nan, shush, shush." And I said, "Do you know what? It's fine. Your Nan's enjoying herself. It's a joyful day. You know, don't worry." So it was so that was fine. What else have I had? Oh, I had all the lights fused at a crematorium, and no music. So the music cut out for the hymns, and so there was nothing. And luckily, I knew that they wanted the curtains to be left open, so that wasn't a problem at the committal. And we just paused the ceremony, and I found the music on my phone, and we played the hymns from my phone, and it was fine. Well, so always have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D.
So Judy, can we talk about you setting up your own business, Cherish Ceremonies?
Yeah, that took me forever, because I've been self-employed when I lived in France, but I'd never done it in the UK. I'd always been, you know, a civil servant through and through. So I had to discover an awful lot. I did a quick course with the local Chamber of Commerce, and found a good accountant, because I knew that would be, you know, that would be worth its weight in gold. Finding my branding was quite tough. It was because I knew it would have to stay with me. And that was something I'd learned when I lived and worked in France, because I did some work for Chanel, for their eyewear division, not their haute couture. And I learned an awful lot about branding and brand awareness, brand identity, which I'd studied in my MBA anyway. But seeing how protective Chanel was of their brand, I thought, well, if it works for them, it'll work for me, and I've got to get it right. So finding the colours and the logo and my strapline, which is Cherish Ceremonies, for the ceremony of your life. And I thought that covers both sides of funeral, and so I only need one set of paperwork. Because if I'd got a name like Cherish Celebrations, it wouldn't have fit the funeral side. So it was quite a long process to find the right title. Some celebrants will use their name as their business name, but I decided against that. I didn't want to be too closely identified with the brand, because I didn't know in future. I wanted to future-proof it in case I wanted to sell it, or I might have taken other people on, or I didn't want it closely allied to my name. And I like that. I like the word cherish. It just says such a lot.
I think I've had a good look around on the website, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. You've done a really good job on it. Good job.
Oh, thank you very much. I had a lot of help, and it does need some updating. I just updated my logo. So it's just finding time, to work on the back end of what you do.
Yeah. So, Judy, can we talk about people renewing their vows? You hear a lot about this, particularly with people in the public eye. Is it a thing? Is it a trend? Is it something we should all think about? Where's it all come from?
Well, I think it's just a way of marking an occasion, and that's absolutely fine. Yeah, Hello Magazine are full of it. Rod Stewart, who's a particular pash, he's my secret crush. He and Penny Lancaster renewed their vows, their 10-year wedding anniversary. And I suppose some people will use it as an excuse to have a wonderful, to wear a lovely dress again and have a party. And then you think, well, what's wrong with having a party and celebrating where you are? Other couples may do it after a period of illness, or perhaps, something momentous has happened in their life and they want to really mark that. So again, it's all about story. One of my very favourites was a very dear couple in Warwickshire, and I've been involved with the family for various ceremonies, weddings and farewell funeral services. But this couple had been married for 50 years, just the most glorious couple, still as much in love after 50 years as they were when they first met. And they weren't afraid to show it and to talk about it, and that was really endearing. So we went back through their story and we looked at where the world was 50 years ago when they married and when they said their vows to one another. They realised, until we sat and chatted, just how much they'd achieved over that 50-year lifespan. Because in the busyness of life, sometimes we forget, to look back at how far we've come. Sometimes you can get just bound up in the here and now and the stresses of modern life, or you can look ahead and it might seem insurmountable. But always, I think, look at just what you've achieved and tell that story. And it's lovely for the children and the grandchildren to hear that story as well, and for those words to be spoken aloud, because it's part of who they are as well. So that was just such a joyful occasion. The room was filled with all their closest friends and relatives, and I loved it.
I think that's such a lovely idea, as you say, sharing their life with the family, and obviously the family had changed over 50 years, and I think that's a lovely idea. So Judy, can you talk us through a typical day or a typical week for you? I mean, are you out every Saturday, officiating at some ceremony? Or?
I used to be. I kill weddings now. After 9 years of missing out on weekends, I tend to do more on the funeral side now than weddings. A typical week when I was doing weddings, you'll get a wedding request sometimes 2-3 years in advance. Brides will book the date because they'll book their venue and then they'll want to ensure that they get a celebrant. So you can have dates 2-3 years in advance, and which makes trying to get your own summer holiday in quite interesting. I'd be doing weddings Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I only ever do one wedding a day, because you never know if there's going to be a delay. I think the record delay was 1.25 hours. It was a dress malfunction. The bride was trying to get into her dress, yanked at the zip on the side that had got caught in the lace, and the zip just exploded. So her mum was sewing her into the dress, and I got a sobbing bride on the phone. Then her mum came on and said, "Oh, it's all terrible." And I said, "I'm not going anywhere. Don't worry. I'll bring the drinks that you were having at the end, the toast. I'll bring that forward, and people can chat amongst themselves. I'll tell them, that there's a delay, and then we'll carry on." If it had been a registrar wedding, they'd have had to have gone on to the next wedding, because they do 6 a day, on a busy day. So that used to be my weekends. And then, of course, in the week leading up to it, it would have been final rehearsals, read through, ensure the scripts are all printed, make sure you've got all your accoutrements with you, because if they're having little rituals in the ceremony, like a candle lighting or a sand pouring, sand blending ceremony, or a tree planting, you have to make sure you've got everything with you for that, because we personalise ceremonies with little rituals, hand tying or hand fasting, for example, as well. That was incredibly busy throughout wedding season, which typically would run from around about the end of April, around about Easter time, through to October. That was the busiest time. And I think for a couple of years, I worked every single weekend, not a weekend off. So my husband would grumble a little bit about it, you know, that we couldn't go away for the weekend, for example. That was that. So I've eased back a little bit on weddings. My colleagues are so busy because, of course, last year weddings were cancelled in the UK. So last year, of course, with the pandemic, there was a lockdown in the UK, and there were no weddings at all. Churches had their doors locked, register offices were closed. So there was this whole host of brides absolutely desperate, you know, for their weddings. So the 2021. So the back end of 2020 moved forward, and then people who were wanting 2020 and 2021 weddings, the registrars are fully booked, the churches are fully booked. So celebrants have come into their own, because everybody's thinking, oh yes, there is another way. We can go and find a celebrant and have a ceremony with them, which is great for our profession. So my typical week now, today already, I had a phone call with a funeral director asking me my availability for a service next week. I had to approve an order of service for a proof check, an order of service for a funeral that's taking place tomorrow, final check. I phoned in a family for a service I'm doing on Friday, just to make sure that they're happy with the script. I always send a draft script so they can look through it and make sure I haven't got a name wrong or a date wrong or anything like that. So what else did I do? Oh, I went and delivered some more business cards to a funeral director. So that's today already. So it's quite busy, but you're as busy as you want to be. We can always say no.
I mean, I guess with the pandemic, all hell broke loose. So can we just clarify, Judy, the difference between a registrar and a celebrant?
Right. With the law of England and Wales, as it currently stands, you have to register your marriage with a registrar, just like you register a birth or you register a death. Then you can go on to have a wedding celebration ceremony with a celebrant. So just in the way that you register a birth and then you have the christening ceremony wherever and whenever you want it, at the other end of life, you register a death and then you have the funeral ceremony wherever and whenever you want it. You don't have to have the ceremony with the registrar. You can just do the registration, which costs, I think it's £47. And then you can have your ceremony wherever you want. And it doesn't need to be a licensed venue because you've already done that bit. So it's separating out the legal and the ceremonial. But right now, the Law Commission has done a huge review into weddings law in England and Wales. One of the findings is that humanists and independent celebrants should be allowed to carry out legal weddings. So we've got our fingers crossed. That will be put to Parliament before the end of the year for consideration. So there could be a massive change in the way weddings are carried out in England and Wales.
I was going to say that is going to be huge for your profession. So many venues are open to having ceremonies from the crazy to the elegant to in your garden. If that goes through, I mean, your telephone is just going to go into meltdown.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and
you've currently got.
Yeah, it is, and they're trying to work through. There's a lot of exhausted celebrants, but I'd like to, give a huge round of applause to all celebrants for how they've coped during this year, because they've seen, celebrants have seen their incomes plummet. They might have had 30 weddings booked that were all of a sudden, disappeared from their diary, and all that income, that disappeared. And celebrants who, funeral celebrants as well, that was really, really tough when there were only 4 people allowed at a funeral. That was hard. But this week is World Celebrant Week. And it's the very first one, and it's it was the brainchild of 2 celebrants who run a business called the Celebrants Collective, Natasha and Claire. And Natasha actually is a celebrant based in Spain. I think she's near Malaga. So it was their brainchild, and it's really spread. And that's the joy of social media. There are celebrants in Australia, New Zealand, in France, Spain, Italy, Greece, all Iceland, I think as well, all joining in across social media using the hashtag WCW 2021. And it's just a joy, really, for us all to reach out to one another. We tend to be a very supportive crowd of one another.
So, Judy, just before we finish, if somebody's listening to this podcast and thinking, okay, this sounds something I might be interested in, what would be the first step for them to find out information, see if it is something for them?
I would say, do your research, have a look in your local area, how much demand there's likely to be, how many celebrants are already operating in your area. Are you going to get enough income to support yourself, or are you going to use it as additional income? So do your financial sums first, and then talk to go and find a local celebrant, invite them for coffee and have a chat. And then look at all the different training organisations, have a chat with each one of them and see which one feels right to you. And then I would say, get yourself some good training under your belt and go for it. I haven't regretted it, and I don't know a celebrant who has.
Well, it certainly sounds a very interesting, I don't want to say job, a very interesting profession or calling, because it's not flowers and romance. I mean, you are dealing with some very, very sensitive issues as well. So it's not all fun and games. But Judy, thank you so much for opening up the world of being a celebrant, explaining what it involves, the training. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Sheila. And I can talk about celebrancy till the cows come home. So it's lovely to have such a willing audience. Thank you very much.
You are very welcome. Thank you, Judy. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation. Don't forget, if you have a story you would like to tell, please get in touch. My email address is allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com, and thank you for listening.